Have you ever wondered what life as a medieval knight was really like? Tonight, we're moving into a quieter side of history. Not the shining legends, but the heavier reality beneath the armor. There are no dragons here, no perfect heroes. Just a life shaped by responsibility, constant tension, aching bodies, and the steady effort of getting through days in heavy steel, moving from battlefields to restless nights, while the idea of glory slowly wears thin. While you rest in your warm beds, we will slowly step into the world of the medieval knights. Before you relax, take 1 minute to like the video and write in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. Meeting people from all over the world is always a great feeling. Let's begin. Most people meet medieval knights first through stories, not history books, not dusty records, but tales told long after the armor was hung up for good. In these stories, knights are tall, fearless, and almost untouched by the weight of the world. They ride strong horses, wear polished armor that never seems to chafe, and step into battle knowing glory is waiting on the other side. It's a clean image, comfortable even, and for centuries, that image has survived far better than the people it claims to represent. But that image was already a fantasy even in the Middle Ages. The idea of knighthood as something noble, honorable, and desirable didn't come from daily life. It came from poems, songs, and courtly stories written for people who were not the ones doing the fighting. These stories were meant to inspire loyalty, justify power, and soften the brutal reality of a violent social system. They created a dream that sounded convincing enough to accept without looking too closely. For a young boy growing up in medieval Europe, especially one born into a noble family, this dream was everywhere. He would hear songs about brave men who earned land, respect, and the admiration of kings. He would see tapestries showing heroic scenes where pain, fear, and exhaustion were quietly edited out. To him, becoming a knight might look like purpose, like meaning, like a life that mattered. What he wouldn't see yet was the cost, because the real path to knighthood did not begin with honor. It began with discipline so strict it bordered on cruelty. At a young age, often around 7, a boy would be sent away from home to serve in another noble household as a page. This was not an adventure, it was a reshaping. He learned obedience before he learned confidence. He learned silence before he learned speech. Every mistake was noticed, corrected, and remembered. As he grew older and became a squire, the dream narrowed even further. This was the stage where fantasy and reality began to collide. Training was constant. Weapons were heavy. Armor bruised skin and strained joints. Falling was common, and injuries were not treated gently or quickly. Pain was something to endure quietly, because complaining marked weakness, and weakness had consequences. Even at this stage, the idea of glory still lingered, but it was already fading. Battles were not grand moments of individual heroism. They were chaotic, loud, and confusing. A knight did not always know who was winning, where the enemy was, or whether the person charging toward him was a threat or an ally. Visibility was poor. Commands were lost in the noise. Fear was constant, even for experienced fighters. The dream suggested control. Reality delivered uncertainty. Armor, often imagined as a symbol of strength, was also a burden. It trapped heat in summer and cold in winter. It limited movement, slowed reactions, and made even simple tasks exhausting. Wearing it for hours at a time drained energy long before any fighting began. Knights did not stride effortlessly into battle. They arrived already tired. And once the fighting started, there was no clean line between courage and survival. A knight fought because retreat could mean shame, punishment, or death. He fought because he was trained to obey, not because every cause inspired him. Loyalty was not always a choice. It was an expectation enforced by land ownership, debt, and obligation. This is where the dream truly breaks down. The popular image suggests that knights chose their battles, defended the weak, and acted as moral anchors in a violent world. In reality, most knights fought because they were ordered to. They protected interests, not ideals. Many campaigns had little to do with justice, and everything to do with land disputes, inheritance arguments, or political pressure from above. And the rewards were far from guaranteed. Only a small number of knights gained lasting wealth or influence. Many remained minor figures, tied to a lord who could replace them if they became inconvenient. Equipment was expensive, horses were fragile, and injuries could end a career overnight. A broken leg or damaged hand did not come with compensation. It came with quiet removal from usefulness. The dream promised honor, reality delivered dependency. Even the social respect associated with knighthood was more fragile than it appears. Knights were admired but also feared. They were tools of violence in a society that relied on force to maintain order. When peace came or when money ran out, knights could quickly become a problem rather than an asset. History records many periods where unemployed knights drifted into banditry simply because they had no other skills and no place to go. This was not an exception. It was a pattern. And yet, despite all this, the dream survived. It survived because it served a purpose. It convinced young men to endure hardship. It justified wars. It gave meaning to suffering by wrapping it in stories of honor and destiny. The dream didn't need to be true. It only needed to be believable enough. What's important to understand is that medieval people were not naive. Many knights knew the reality of their position very well. They felt the weight of armor on aching shoulders. They knew how thin the line was between respect and irrelevance. But stepping away from the role was rarely an option. Once on that path, turning back meant losing identity, status, and protection. So the dream became something you carried quietly alongside the truth. Not because it matched reality, but because reality alone was too heavy to face without it. And this tension between image and experience shaped everything that followed. It influenced how knights behaved, how they justified their actions, and how they coped with fear and loss. It explains why so many accounts from the period swing between exaggerated heroism and deep exhaustion. Both were real. They just didn't exist at the same time, in the way stories suggest. Understanding this difference is the first step to understanding why being a medieval knight was far less glamorous than it appears. The rest of the story lives in the details that come after the dream fades, when daily life takes over and survival becomes the real measure of success. And that's where things start to get even heavier. By the time most people imagine someone deciding to become a knight, the decision has already been made years earlier, not by the boy himself, and often not even with his consent. Knighthood, for the vast majority, was not an ambition discovered over time. It was a direction set at birth, quietly and firmly, long before the child understood what it meant. In medieval society, who you were mattered more than what you wanted. Family lineage shaped your future with remarkable precision. If you were born into a noble household, especially one that owned land or owed military service to a higher lord, your path narrowed almost immediately. You were not raised to ask what kind of life suited you. You were raised to fill a role that already existed. This is where modern ideas of choice begin to fall apart. A noble family did not see its children as blank slates. Sons were resources, strategic ones. One might be prepared for the church, another for managing land, and another for war. These decisions were not about personality or talent. They were about necessity. Military obligation was built into the feudal system, and families had to provide fighters to protect their position and keep their claims intact. If your family needed a knight, you became the knight. This expectation was communicated early, not through long explanations, but through daily structure. Boys destined for knighthood were surrounded by symbols of it from childhood. Weapons hung on walls. Stories praised ancestors who fought and died in service. Respect was shown to warriors, not thinkers or artists. Even play mirrored preparation. Mock combat, wooden swords, and competitive physical games were encouraged because they reinforced the identity being built. And once that identity began to form, stepping away from it became increasingly difficult. Family pressure did not always come in the form of harsh commands. Often it was quieter, more persistent. Pride, duty, and obligation were woven into everyday language. A boy was reminded of his name, his bloodline, and the expectations attached to both. Failing to live up to that legacy was framed not as a personal choice, but as a moral failure. You didn't just disappoint yourself, you dishonored your family. That kind of pressure leaves very little room to breathe. By the time formal training began, usually before adolescence, the idea of choosing a different life had already faded. Serving as a page in another household was presented as an honor, but it was also a form of separation. The child was removed from familiar surroundings and placed into a system that reinforced obedience, hierarchy, and endurance. This wasn't education in the modern sense. It was conditioning. Every task, no matter how small, served a larger purpose. Learning to stand silently for long periods, responding immediately to commands, accepting correction without argument. These habits were not accidental. They were designed to prepare someone to follow orders under pressure, without hesitation. As a squire, the process intensified. The body was trained relentlessly, but so was the mind. A squire learned that hesitation could be dangerous, but questioning authority could be worse. Loyalty was emphasized not as a feeling, but as a rule. You served your knight. Your knight served a lord. The lord served a king. The structure was clear, and breaking it carried consequences that went far beyond personal dissatisfaction. What's important here is that at no point was there a formal moment of consent. There was no stage where someone asked, "Is this what you want?" The assumption was already built into the system. If you were here, this was your role. If you struggled, you endured. If you failed, you were replaced. Choice implies alternatives. For most future knights, alternatives barely existed. Leaving the path was possible in theory, but devastating in practice. A noble-born youth who rejected knighthood risked losing status, protection, and financial support. He might still live, but as someone diminished, someone who did not fulfill his expected function. In a society where identity was tied tightly to social role, this was not a small loss. It was a complete reshaping of one's place in the world. Even those who doubted their future rarely voiced it. And fear played a role here too, not just fear of battle, but fear of being unmade. A knight was someone recognized, someone with a defined position. Stepping away meant becoming uncertain, vulnerable, and often isolated. For many, enduring a difficult path felt safer than stepping into the unknown. This is why so many knights continued forward. Even when enthusiasm faded, they weren't chasing glory. They were fulfilling an expectation they had never been invited to question. It's also why medieval knighthood produced such a wide range of experiences. Some embraced the role and found meaning in it. Others simply survived it. But almost all were shaped by the same underlying truth. This life was assigned, not selected. The ceremony of knighthood itself reinforces this idea. It's often imagined as a moment of triumph, but in reality it was also a point of no return. Once dubbed a knight, expectations intensified. Responsibilities multiplied. The room for hesitation vanished almost completely. You were no longer training, you were accountable. From that moment on, your body, your time, and often your future belonged to others. And this lack of choice didn't end with the battlefield. It influenced marriage, finances, and daily life. Knights were expected to marry strategically, manage estates if given one, and produce heirs who would continue the cycle. Even in peacetime, the role followed them. There was little separation between the person and the function. Understanding this helps explain why medieval knighthood often feels contradictory. How could a role so idealized produce so much quiet frustration, exhaustion, and bitterness? Because it was never designed around personal fulfillment. It was designed around stability, control, and obligation. The system didn't ask whether it made individuals happy, it asked whether it worked. And for centuries, it did. But working did not mean humane. It meant efficient, it meant predictable. It meant that when conflict arose, trained fighters would be available to respond, regardless of how they felt about it. This is the foundation everything else rests on. The physical hardship, the emotional strain, the constant exposure to danger, all of it becomes clearer once we understand that most knights didn't arrive at this life through desire. They arrived through inheritance. And once you see that, the question changes. It's no longer why did knights endure such difficult lives. It becomes how could they have done anything else? As we move forward, this lack of choice will continue to matter. It shapes how knights experienced fear, how they handled pain, and how they related to violence itself. Because when something isn't chosen, surviving it becomes a very different kind of challenge. And that challenge followed them everywhere, even when the armor came off. For many future knights, childhood did not slowly fade into responsibility. It was interrupted, not suddenly, not violently, but firmly and early, like a door closing, before someone had time to notice it was open. While other children might still be learning through play without consequences, those on the knight's path were already being reshaped by routine, expectation, and discipline. Training did not begin with armor or weapons. That came much later. It began with posture, silence, and awareness. A child meant for knighthood learned very early how to stand still, how to wait without complaint, and how to watch without speaking. These may sound small, but they formed the base of everything that followed. Before strength or skill, obedience came first. Around the age when most modern children are still discovering what they enjoy, noble boys were often sent away from home. This wasn't framed as abandonment. It was described as an honor. Serving as a page in the household of another noble was considered a privilege, a step upward. But for the child, it meant separation from familiarity and comfort at a time when both mattered deeply. Daily life as a page was structured down to the smallest detail. The day began early and followed a strict rhythm. Tasks were repetitive and often tiring. Carrying messages, serving meals, cleaning equipment, and attending to guests were all part of the routine. These chores weren't meant to teach domestic skills. They were meant to teach endurance, attention, and humility. Mistakes were corrected immediately, sometimes sharply. The lesson wasn't just how to do something correctly, but how to accept correction without resistance. Emotional expression was discouraged. Complaining marked weakness. Hesitation suggested unreliability. Over time, children learned to suppress instinctive reactions and replace them with controlled responses. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was preparation. The medieval world did not reward softness, especially in those expected to fight. Training aimed to harden the body and narrow the mind toward function. A future knight was expected to endure discomfort without slowing down. Long hours on their feet, heavy workloads, and limited rest became normal early on. The idea was simple. If hardship became familiar in youth, it would be less shocking later. Physical training appeared gradually, woven into daily activity rather than introduced as formal lessons at first. Carrying heavy items, walking long distances, and maintaining balance while serving all contributed to physical development. Games that involved strength, coordination, or competition were encouraged, but they were rarely just for fun. There was always an underlying lesson. As boys grew older and became squires, training intensified. Now the connection between effort and survival became clearer. Weapon practice began, first with wooden tools, then with steel. Armor was introduced slowly, its weight increasing over time. Learning to move, run, and fight, while burdened by metal, was exhausting, and that was the point. What's often overlooked is how mentally demanding this period was. Training required constant focus. A distracted squire was a liability. Attention drifted, injuries followed. Every exercise reinforced the idea that lapses had consequences. Over time, this shaped a mindset that prioritized alertness, even during exhaustion. Childhood curiosity had little space to grow here. Questions about why things were done a certain way were rarely welcomed. The system valued repetition over exploration. Mastery came from doing the same thing again and again until it became instinctive. Original thinking was not useless, but it was secondary to reliability. There were moments of pride, of course. Praise existed, but it was measured. Too much encouragement risked complacency. Approval was given sparingly and often quietly. A nod, a word, enough to motivate, not enough to distract. Emotionally, this environment created distance. Many young trainees learned to keep feelings contained. Fear, excitement, frustration, all were things to manage internally. Showing too much of any emotion could draw attention, and attention often meant correction. Over time, silence became a shield. This emotional restraint followed knights into adulthood. It's one reason historical accounts often describe them as reserved or severe. It wasn't personality alone. It was habit, built over years when emotional control was tied to approval and safety. Training also reshaped how young boys viewed pain. Minor injuries were common and rarely treated as significant. Bruises, cuts, and soreness were expected. Complaints were met with indifference or mild disapproval. Pain became something to acknowledge briefly and then ignore. This attitude served knights later in battle, but it also carried long-term consequences. Rest was limited, not absent, but never excessive. The idea of sleeping until fully refreshed was unfamiliar. Fatigue became a constant background condition. Learning to function while tired was part of the process. A knight who needed ideal conditions to perform was unreliable. Training ensured that performance continued even when conditions were far from ideal. One of the most subtle effects of early training was how it shaped identity. By adolescence, many squires no longer thought of knighthood as something they were becoming. It was simply who they were. The role had been reinforced for so long that imagining another life felt abstract, almost impossible. This didn't mean everyone accepted it easily. Some struggled quietly. Others adapted by detaching emotionally. A few embraced the structure and found comfort in its predictability. But regardless of internal response, the external path remained the same. Training left little room for childhood in the way we understand it today. There was laughter, there were friendships, but they existed within boundaries. Free time was limited. Exploration was controlled. Innocence didn't shatter dramatically. It thinned, day by day, until responsibility replaced it almost without notice. By the time formal knighthood approached, the hardest part was already done. Not the fighting, not the danger, but the shaping. The long years of preparation had turned children into individuals who could endure repetition, suppress fear, and obey under pressure. From the outside, this process produced capable warriors. From the inside, it produced adults who had grown up quickly, sometimes too quickly. The cost of early training wasn't always visible in armor or skill. It appeared later, in fatigue that never quite left, in emotions that stayed buried, and in a quiet distance from the idea of ease. Understanding this makes the life of a knight feel less glamorous and more human. Before the battles, before the titles, there were years of discipline that slowly replaced childhood with readiness. From the outside, armor looks like safety. Solid, shining, reassuring. In paintings and films, it sits perfectly on the body, light enough to move in, strong enough to stop anything that comes close. But for the people who actually wore it, armor was never just protection. It was a constant weight, a daily negotiation between safety and suffering. A full set of armor could weigh anywhere from 20 to 30 kilograms, sometimes more depending on the period and style. And this weight wasn't spread gently across the body the way a modern backpack is. It pulled on the shoulders, pressed into the hips, tightened around the chest, and locked the joints into limited ranges of motion. Simply standing for long periods became tiring. Walking required adjustment. Running demanded real effort. Armor was not something you casually put on and forgot about. Every piece had to be fitted, strapped, buckled, and aligned. This took time and usually help. A knight alone struggled to dress fully. Squires existed partly for this reason. Once the armor was on, it dictated how you moved, how you sat, how you breathed. Heat was one of the biggest problems, and it's rarely talked about. Metal traps warmth underneath the armor. Knights wore padded garments designed to prevent chafing and absorb impact. These layers added bulk and trapped even more heat. On a warm day, or during intense movement, the inside of the armor became unbearable. Sweat soaked everything. Breathing felt heavier. Vision blurred from heat and exhaustion. There was no easy way to cool down. You couldn't simply remove a helmet in the middle of danger. You couldn't loosen straps without risking exposure. Once overheated, a knight had to endure it. Heat exhaustion was real, and it was dangerous. Fatigue slowed reactions. Mistakes followed. Armor also punished stillness. Standing guard in full gear for hours meant aching muscles and numb limbs. Sitting was awkward. Lying down in armor was nearly impossible. If a knight fell asleep in armor, it was usually from pure exhaustion, not comfort. And then there was the noise. Every movement came with sound. Metal plates shifted, rings rubbed together, straps creaked. Stealth was difficult. Silence required practice. Even then, armor announced your presence in ways you couldn't fully control. Despite all this, armor was necessary. Without it, injuries were worse, often fatal. A well-made breastplate could stop a sword, deflect a spear, or turn a deadly strike into a survivable blow. Knights understood this balance clearly. Armor didn't make you invincible. It made survival more likely, at a cost. That cost showed up in the body over time. Joint pain was common. Knees, hips, and shoulders suffered from constant strain. The weight compressed the spine day after day. Long-term wear contributed to stiffness and chronic pain, especially as knights aged. Armor also restricted senses. Vision was limited by helmets. Hearing was dulled. Peripheral awareness shrank. This forced knights to rely more on training and instinct. You couldn't react to everything you saw or heard. You learned to focus on what mattered most. Falling in armor was dangerous. Getting back up was slow. A knight on the ground was vulnerable, not because the armor failed, but because movement was restricted. Training emphasized staying upright for this reason. Balance mattered as much as strength. Maintenance was another burden. Armor required constant care. Rust was an enemy. Straps wore out. Padding needed repair. A neglected piece could fail at the worst moment. Keeping armor functional took time, effort, and resources. Armor also changed how a knight related to the world. Touch was dulled. Temperature differences blurred. Rain felt different. Wind barely reached the skin. Over time, some knights described a sense of separation, like living inside a shell. You were present, but not fully exposed. This separation had mental effects. Armor became a kind of barrier, not just physical but emotional. Inside it, fear was easier to hide. Expressions were concealed. Voices echoed. Identity narrowed to function. You were no longer just a person. You were a role encased in metal. Removing armor brought relief, but also vulnerability. Without it, the body felt lighter but exposed. Many knights described a strange discomfort when unarmored, as if something essential was missing. The weight became familiar. Its absence felt wrong. It's important to understand that armor was not worn only in battle. Knights often traveled in partial armor, trained in it, stood watch in it. The body adapted, but adaptation didn't mean comfort. It meant endurance. Weather made everything worse. Rain turned armor cold and slippery. Sun turned it into an oven. Cold stiffened joints and numbed fingers. Armor protected against weapons, not nature. And yet, despite all of this, armor remained central to a knight's life. It was expensive, carefully crafted, and often deeply personal. Knights learned the feel of every piece, every weakness, every pressure point. Armor became familiar, in the way a burden becomes familiar, never pleasant, but expected. Understanding this strips away the fantasy. Armor was not freedom. It was a compromise. Safety traded for strain, protection exchanged for pain. Every hour spent inside it reminded the wearer that survival came at a physical price. This reality shaped how knights moved, fought, rested, and aged. The armor did its job, but it asked for payment every single day. A knight without a horse was not really a knight. at least not in the way people imagined one. The horse was not just transport. It was status, power, speed, and survival combined into one living being. Armor could protect the body, weapons could extend reach, but without a horse, a knight lost most of what made him effective on the battlefield and respected outside it. Owning a horse was expensive, and not just once. It was a constant cost that followed a knight throughout his life. Good war horses were rare and carefully bred. They were larger, stronger, and trained to stay calm in chaos. This alone made them costly. A knight might spend a huge part of his family's wealth just to acquire one suitable horse. But buying the horse was only the beginning. A horse needed daily care. It needed food, water, rest, grooming, and shelter. Grain was not cheap, especially during hard seasons. A working horse ate a lot, and a war horse even more. When supplies were low, people could go hungry, but the horse still had to eat. Without it, the knight's role disappeared. Horses were also fragile in ways armor was not. Metal could be repaired, leather could be replaced. A horse, once injured badly, might never recover. A twisted leg, a deep cut, an infection, any of these could end its usefulness or its life. There were no modern treatments, no antibiotics, no surgery as we know it today. An injury that seems manageable now could be a death sentence then. Battle was especially dangerous for horses. They were large targets. Arrows, spears, and spikes aimed at legs or chests could bring them down. A fallen horse often meant a fallen knight, and a fallen knight in armor was slow to rise. Many knights died, not because they were struck directly, but because their horse went down beneath them. Even away from battle, risk was constant. Horses could slip, panic, fall ill, or injure themselves on rough terrain. Roads were poor, weather was harsh. Long marches exhausted animals. A knight had to constantly judge how far he could push his horse without breaking it. Training a war horse was another challenge. These animals had to move toward noise, fire, shouting, and violence, things most animals naturally avoid. Training took years and patience. Not every horse succeeded. Some never adjusted. Others became dangerous, unpredictable, or overly aggressive. Losing a horse was not just emotional, it was practical and social damage. Without a horse, a knight could not fight as expected. His standing dropped, his usefulness declined. Replacing a horse took time and money that many knights did not have readily available. There was also the matter of equipment. Saddles, bridles, horseshoes, blankets, and armor for the horse itself all required upkeep. Each piece could wear out or break. Each repair cost something. Neglecting equipment risked injury to the animal and the rider. Weather affected horses deeply. Cold stiffened muscles. Heat caused exhaustion. Rain softened hooves and led to infection. Mud made movement difficult and dangerous. A knight had to understand these limits. Pushing a horse too far could mean losing it forever. Rest was critical, but often impossible. Campaigns did not pause for animal recovery. Marches continued. Battles happened when they happened. A knight constantly balanced urgency against the health of his horse, knowing that one bad decision could end both of their chances. Horses also bonded with their riders. Knights often trusted their mounts deeply. They learned each other's movements and moods. This bond improved performance but made loss harder. Losing a horse meant losing a partner, not just a tool. Some knights owned more than one horse, but this was a luxury. Most had one primary mount and perhaps a weaker backup. Losing the main horse was devastating. Using a lesser animal reduced speed, strength, and confidence in battle. Illness was another threat. Disease spread quickly among animals. Poor sanitation, crowded stables, and long travel created perfect conditions for sickness. A single outbreak could wipe out entire groups of horses, leaving knights stranded and powerless. Even feeding a horse properly required knowledge. Too little weakened it. Too much of the wrong food caused illness. Clean water was essential but not always available. Knights depended on grooms and stable workers, people whose labor often went unnoticed but was vital. The social meaning of a horse mattered too. A strong, well-kept horse reflected well on its rider. A thin or injured horse suggested weakness or poverty. Appearances mattered in a world built on reputation. This reality made knighthood fragile. One injury, one illness, one bad moment could strip a knight of his defining feature. Armor alone did not make a knight. Weapons alone did not. The horse tied everything together, and without it, the image collapsed. So while stories focus on swords and shields, the quiet truth is that many knights lived in constant worry over their animals. Caring for a horse was not optional. It was central, demanding, and unforgiving. Knighthood depended not just on courage or skill, but on the health of another living being, one that could not speak, could not explain its pain, and could fail without warning. And that made the life of a knight far more uncertain than the legends ever admit. A knight's life did not move in clear phases of peace and war. There was no sharp line where normal life ended and fighting began. War was always close, sometimes loud and visible, sometimes quiet, and only felt in the air. Even during calm years, a knight lived as if violence could return at any moment, because very often it did. This constant readiness shaped everything. Daily routines, personal choices, even the way a knight slept, were influenced by the idea that tomorrow might not be peaceful. Armor needed to be ready. Weapons had to stay close. The horse had to be fit. There was no room for complete relaxation, because the cost of being unprepared was high. Unlike modern soldiers, knights did not serve fixed terms. There was no clear start or end date to their duty. If their lord called, they went. If borders were threatened, they moved. If rumors of rebellion spread, they prepared. Sometimes these calls came with warning. Often they did not. A knight might be eating, resting, or attending a local event when news arrived. A messenger, dusty and tired, carrying orders that could change everything. Within hours, life shifted. Goodbyes were rushed. Plans were dropped. The road called again. This uncertainty created a constant mental pressure. Knights could not fully invest in peace. Farming land, raising children, building long-term comfort, all of these were interrupted again and again. Even at home, the thought of being summoned stayed in the background. Weapons were not ceremonial objects kept for display. They were tools that needed care and familiarity. Swords were cleaned and sharpened regularly. Straps were checked. Shields were repaired. Neglecting these tasks during calm times meant risking failure when violence returned. Training never truly stopped. Even older knights kept their skills sharp. Sparring, riding, and practicing movements were part of everyday life. Not because battle was happening now, but because it could happen soon. Armor, heavy and uncomfortable as it was, had to be worn often enough to remain familiar. A knight needed to know how it felt after hours of movement, how it restricted vision, how breathing changed inside it. Putting on armor only when war arrived would be dangerous. The body needed memory. Sleep was rarely deep, not because danger was always present, but because responsibility was. Knights often slept lightly, ready to wake quickly. Night alarms were common. Camps were noisy, tense places, even when nothing happened. This readiness extended beyond physical preparation. Mentally, a knight had to accept that violence was part of life. Fear could not be eliminated, but it had to be managed. Too much fear froze action. Too little led to reckless mistakes. The waiting itself was exhausting. Long periods of tension followed by short bursts of violence drained the body and mind. Campaigns involved endless marching, standing guard, watching horizons, listening for signs of attack. Many days passed without action, yet required full attention. During these times, boredom mixed with anxiety. Knights could not leave their posts. They could not relax fully. Time moved slowly, and the body stayed tense. This constant alert state wore people down over years. Knights also had to be ready for different kinds of war. Large battles were rare. More common were raids, skirmishes, and sudden attacks. These did not follow clear rules. They came at dawn, at night, during storms, or in narrow paths where armor was less useful. This unpredictability meant that knights needed flexibility. They had to be ready to fight, mounted or on foot, in open fields or tight spaces. Plans changed quickly. Orders shifted mid-march. Home was not always safe either. Castles were targets. Villages were attacked. A knight might defend his land one season and attack another's the next. Alliances changed. Loyalty was tested. Constant readiness also affected relationships. Knights were often absent. When present, they carried the weight of what might come next. It was hard to fully relax with family when departure always felt near. This life created a strange balance. Knights learned to live in moments. They enjoyed small comforts deeply because they were uncertain. A warm meal, a quiet evening, a safe night of sleep became valuable because they might not last. Yet this readiness came at a cost. The body stayed tense. Injuries healed poorly under stress. Sleep was shallow. The mind never fully rested. Over time, this constant alertness shortened lives. There was no clear reward for enduring this state. Glory was uncertain. Recognition depended on survival and luck. Many knights lived and died without their names remembered. The legends focus on decisive battles and heroic charges. The reality was long stretches of waiting, preparing, and worrying. War was not an event, it was a condition. And this constant readiness, this inability to fully step away from violence, shaped knights more than any single battle ever could. A medieval battle began long before the first blow was struck. It started with movement, tension, and waiting. Knights lined up knowing that once it began, there would be no control over how it ended. Plans existed, but they were fragile. The moment bodies collided, those plans often disappeared. When the fight started, everything compressed into a small space. Vision narrowed. Sound overwhelmed thought. A knight inside the battle could not see the whole field, could not understand the full situation, and could not pause to think clearly. Decisions were made in fragments, based on instinct and habit, rather than careful judgment. Armor limited awareness from the very first step. Helmets reduced side vision, and breathing became louder inside the metal. Sweat formed quickly, even in cold weather. As the body heated up, focus dropped. Every movement required effort, and that effort added up fast. Once lines met, the battlefield became crowded and unstable. People pushed forward without seeing where they were stepping. Mud, blood, broken weapons, and fallen bodies covered the ground. Balance was never guaranteed. A single slip could put a knight on the ground, where danger multiplied instantly. There was no clear rhythm to fighting. Blows came from unexpected angles. Horses surged forward, then suddenly stopped. A knight might be engaged with one opponent when another appeared from the side or behind. There was no warning. Awareness extended only as far as the eye could see, which was rarely far. Noise erased clarity. Metal struck metal constantly. Shields cracked. Swords scraped and rang. Horses screamed in pain or panic. Men shouted orders, warnings, or nothing at all. Inside this noise, individual voices disappeared. Even familiar sounds were hard to identify. Because of this, coordination broke down quickly. Groups lost shape. Individuals moved based on immediate threats rather than strategy. A knight followed motion more than instruction. If the people around him advanced, he advanced. If they pulled back, he followed. This created sudden shifts. A strong position could collapse without clear reason. A retreat could turn into a full withdrawal in seconds. Momentum mattered more than planning. Once fear entered the group, it spread fast. Combat itself was not graceful. It was close, exhausting, and violent. Knights did not exchange long sequences of strikes. Most encounters were brief and desperate. A few blows, a shove, a stumble, then separation or collapse. Energy drained rapidly. Breathing became difficult inside armor. Vision blurred with sweat. Hands tightened around weapons until fingers ached. After only a short time, strength faded. Movements slowed. Reaction time suffered. Even skilled fighters made mistakes when fatigue set in. The ground fight was especially dangerous. When a knight fell, the armor that once protected him became a weight. Getting up required space and time, both of which were scarce. Other fighters moved around and over him. Horses stepped without care. The ground was no longer neutral, it was hostile. Many deaths happened in these moments. Not from clean strikes, but from being pinned, crushed, stabbed through gaps, or unable to move. Panic was common, even among veterans. The body reacted faster than reason. Time behaved strangely during battle. Some moments felt stretched and slow, others passed in an instant. A knight might remember a single strike clearly, while entire minutes vanished from memory. This distortion made later understanding difficult. There was also the constant problem of recognition. Armor and equipment looked similar. Dust and movement made details hard to see. A knight could mistake an enemy for an ally, or hesitate at the wrong moment. These errors were rarely forgiven. Leadership struggled to function under these conditions. Commands required visibility and sound, both of which were unreliable. Leaders could not control what they could not see. Many decisions were made too late or never reached their targets. When injuries happened, there was no pause. A wounded knight either continued or fell behind. Pain was immediate, but often ignored until later. Adrenaline carried people forward beyond what their bodies could safely handle. Battles often ended suddenly. One side broke, not always because they were losing badly, but because fear tipped the balance. Once movement turned backward, it accelerated. Retreat became flight. Order vanished completely. After the fighting stopped, the field was quiet in an unsettling way. The noise dropped, but the tension lingered. Wounded men lay scattered, calling out or silent. Survivors stood exhausted, unsure of what came next. There was no instant relief. The body trembled as adrenaline faded. Pain surfaced. Injuries became clear. Losses were counted slowly. The reality of what had happened settled in piece by piece. For knights, these experiences accumulated. Each battle left marks that training could not erase. Confidence existed, but certainty did not. The next battle always carried unknown risks. This was the true nature of medieval combat. Not controlled, not clean, not understandable from within. It was fast, overwhelming, and deeply human in its chaos. Knights survived not because they mastered battle, but because they endured it. And long after the field emptied, the confusion remained, carried forward into memory, sleep, and the quiet moments between wars. For a medieval knight, injury was not just a temporary setback. It was often a turning point that quietly ended a career, shortened a life, or slowly took away the ability to function normally. Surviving a battle did not mean surviving its consequences. In many cases, the real danger began after the fighting stopped. Wounds were common. Even in small clashes, few knights walked away untouched. Cuts, punctures, crushed bones, and deep bruises were part of the job. Armor reduced the chance of instant death, but it did not prevent injury. Blows transferred force through metal. Falls damaged joints. Weapons slipped into gaps. The body absorbed more damage than it could fully repair. Once injured, recovery depended on factors that were mostly out of the knight's control. Cleanliness was limited. Medical knowledge was basic. Pain relief was minimal. Even a wound that looked manageable could turn dangerous within days. Infections were the greatest threat. Bacteria were not understood, but their effects were well known. A wound could swell, darken, smell bad, and spread pain through the body. Fever followed. Weakness came next. At that point, survival was uncertain. Treatment focused on what could be seen and touched. Wounds were cleaned with water, wine, or herbal mixtures. Sometimes they were burned to stop bleeding. Bandages were reused. Tools were rarely sterile. These efforts helped in some cases, but often made things worse. Bone injuries were especially serious. Broken arms or legs healed slowly, if at all. Without proper alignment, bones set incorrectly. This left lasting pain and limited movement. A knight with a damaged leg might never ride properly again. A damaged arm could mean the end of sword use. Joint injuries were common and permanent. Knees, shoulders, and wrists took heavy stress from armor, combat, and riding. Once damaged, they rarely recovered fully. Pain became constant. Strength faded. Tasks that once felt natural became difficult. Head injuries were also frequent. Helmets reduced damage but did not eliminate it. Blows caused concussions, dizziness, memory problems, and changes in behavior. These effects were poorly understood and rarely treated. Scars were everywhere. Some were shallow, others deep and painful. Scar tissue limited movement and sensitivity. In cold weather, scars often ached intensely. They reminded knights of past battles every day. A knight who could no longer fight effectively faced a hard reality. There was no formal retirement system. Some found roles as trainers, guards, or advisors. Others became dependent on family or their lord's charity. Many simply faded from records. Pain management was minimal. Herbal remedies helped slightly. Alcohol dulled pain but brought other problems. Most knights lived with chronic discomfort. This affected sleep, mood, and focus. Mental effects followed physical injury. Repeated pain wore down patience. Sleep became lighter and shorter. Fear of re-injury lingered. Confidence dropped. Some knights avoided combat not out of cowardice, but because their bodies could no longer endure it. Infections did not always kill quickly. Some spread slowly, weakening the body over weeks or months. Others returned again and again. Each illness reduced strength further. Life expectancy dropped with every serious wound. Even small injuries could become fatal. A cut on the hand could limit grip, become infected, and spread. A leg wound could prevent movement, leading to further complications. The margin for error was thin. Knights also carried injuries into daily life. Farming, traveling, riding, and training all became harder. Pain followed them everywhere. There was no separation between work and recovery. This reality shaped how knights approached risk. Courage existed, but recklessness was rare among veterans. Experience taught them that survival depended on avoiding injury as much as winning. Healing took time, but time was rarely available. Campaigns continued. Duties remained. Many knights returned to activity before wounds healed fully, making long-term damage worse. Over years, the body accumulated damage. Each injury stacked on the last. Aging came faster. Strength declined earlier. Some knights in their 30s felt decades older. Death from injury was not always dramatic. It came quietly, through fever, weakness, or infection, long after battle ended. Families often watched helplessly as someone who survived war slowly faded. This was the unspoken cost of knighthood. Not the sudden death on the field, but the slow erosion of the body afterward. Survival came with a price, and that price was paid daily, in pain, limitation, and loss. In this world, being wounded was rarely just a chapter. It was often the beginning of the end, unfolding quietly while life moved on around them. For a medieval knight, death was rarely the clear, meaningful moment that stories later tried to describe. It did not arrive with applause, with witnesses ready to remember, or with time to understand what was happening. Most of the time, death came quietly, hidden inside chaos, pressure, and confusion. It was not dramatic, it was ordinary. On the battlefield, there was no clean stage where someone stepped forward and fell in a heroic way. Space was tight, bodies were close, movement was constant. Knights were surrounded by others moving in different directions, often without knowing who was beside them. In this environment, death did not stand out. It blended into the noise. Many knights died while simply trying to move. A foot slipped in mud mixed with blood. A shoulder was struck from behind. A horse panicked and crushed someone beneath it. These moments did not look heroic from the outside, and from the inside, there was no time to understand them. Armor added weight and protection, but it also removed flexibility. When a knight lost balance and went down, getting back up was not easy. On a crowded field, there was often no room to rise. Other fighters moved forward, without seeing what was beneath them. boots stepped, hooves landed, bodies piled. In these moments, identity disappeared. No one knew who was who. Titles meant nothing. A knight who had trained for years could die in seconds, unnoticed, simply because the ground gave way or space closed around him. Many deaths happened at the edges of battle, not at the center where banners were visible, but on slopes, in narrow paths, near trees, fences, or ditches. These areas were chaotic and poorly controlled. A knight separated from his group was extremely vulnerable. Crowds increased danger. Blows came from directions that could not be seen. Vision was limited by helmets, dust, and movement. A strike to the back or side ended lives without warning. There was no chance to react or defend. Some knights did not die from wounds at all. Exhaustion played a major role. Heavy armor, intense stress, and lack of air pushed bodies beyond their limits. Hearts failed, lungs struggled. Collapse happened suddenly. These deaths left little visible trace. After battle, bodies lay scattered across the field. Some were recognizable, many were not. Armor was damaged, faces were hidden. Equipment was removed quickly, either by survivors or by those searching afterward. Names were lost. Burial was inconsistent. Important figures were recovered when possible, but many others were left where they fell. Large battles produced too many dead to handle carefully. Graves were shallow or absent. Time erased details fast. For families, this meant uncertainty. News traveled slowly. Sometimes it did not travel at all. A knight simply failed to return. There were no final words, no clear story, only absence. Death also came far from battle. Wounds that seemed survivable became deadly days or weeks later. Infection spread. Fever weakened the body. Strength faded slowly. These deaths were quiet and rarely remembered beyond immediate circles. In these cases, there was no audience, no recognition. A knight died in a bed or on a floor, surrounded by a few people or none at all. The cause was not dramatic, but the result was final. This reality shaped how knights thought about life and service. Many understood that glory was uncertain and brief. Survival depended on luck as much as skill. Experience reduced risk, but never removed it. Fear was constant, even if it was not spoken aloud. Not fear of pain alone, but fear of vanishing without meaning. Some knights leaned on duty, believing that service mattered, even if death did not bring recognition. Others relied on faith, trusting that unseen judgment mattered more than earthly memory. Records from the time reflect this. Many names appear once and never again. No explanation, no detail, just a gap where a life ended. History remembers only fragments. The image of the heroic death grew later, shaped by storytellers who needed clear endings. Reality was messier. Lives ended in places that were never written about, in moments that were never noticed. For the knights themselves, this truth was always present. Each battle carried the knowledge that death could come quietly, without ceremony, without meaning attached. This knowledge did not stop them, but it followed them. And when death came, it rarely paused. It did not announce itself. It simply happened, leaving behind a body in the mud, a name slowly forgotten, and a silence where a life once stood. This was the real ending for many knights. Not a final charge remembered forever, but a quiet disappearance inside noise, pressure, and chance. For a medieval knight, death was not the only fear carried onto the battlefield. In many cases, being captured was considered a worse fate. While death ended struggle, captivity extended it, often for months or even years, filled with uncertainty, loss of control, and slow humiliation. Survival did not always mean relief. Capture usually happened suddenly. A knight might be separated from his group, wounded, exhausted, or simply overwhelmed by numbers. Once disarmed or pinned, resistance ended quickly. At that point, survival depended entirely on the captor's judgment and intentions. Being taken alive was not an act of mercy. It was a calculation. Knights represented value. Their armor, weapons, horses, and status all carried potential profit. Capture was business, not kindness. Once restrained, a knight lost all agency. Armor was stripped away, weapons were removed, personal items disappeared. What remained was the person beneath the symbols of rank, now vulnerable and exposed. The first stage of captivity was often rough. Prisoners were marched, pushed, or tied without care. Wounds were ignored. Food and water were minimal. The goal was control, not comfort. Conditions varied widely depending on who captured the knight. Wealthy captors might keep prisoners alive and reasonably intact to ensure payment. Poorer captors had fewer resources and less patience. In those cases, treatment could be harsh and careless. Ransom defined the experience. A knight's worth was calculated based on name, family, and reputation. Messages were sent. Negotiations began. Until payment arrived, life remained suspended. This waiting period was mentally exhausting. Days passed without certainty. The knight did not know if payment would come, how long it would take, or what condition he would be in when it arrived. Time stretched painfully. Physical conditions were rarely good. Captives were held in rooms, towers, or makeshift spaces not designed for long stays. Light was limited, air was stale. Movement was restricted. Sleep was poor. Hygiene suffered. Clothes were not changed often. Wounds healed badly or not at all. Infections were common. Pain became constant. Food was basic and irregular, enough to survive, rarely enough to feel strong. Hunger became familiar. Weakness followed. Humiliation played a quiet but powerful role. A knight trained to command now followed orders. Pride eroded. Dependence replaced independence. This shift damaged identity deeply. Social status did not protect against this loss. Rank mattered only in terms of ransom value. Daily treatment was often the same, regardless of title. Some captors used psychological pressure. Threats were implied rather than spoken. The possibility of violence always existed, even if rarely used. Fear stayed present. Ransom negotiations could fail. Families might not afford payment. Political situations changed. Captors lost interest or patience. In these cases, captivity extended indefinitely. Some knights were transferred between captors, each change resetting expectations. Each transfer increased uncertainty. Escape was rare and dangerous. Physical weakness, unfamiliar surroundings, and constant supervision made attempts unlikely to succeed. Failure brought punishment. Even when ransom was paid, release was not instant relief. Knights returned physically damaged, financially ruined, and mentally altered. Debts followed them home. Equipment had to be replaced. Reputations suffered. The experience changed how knights viewed future battles. Risk calculation shifted. Capture became a constant fear alongside death. Some knights avoided surrender at all costs. Others accepted capture as part of the profession, but never lightly. The fear of humiliation was powerful. Living under another's control, stripped of status, was deeply unsettling. It haunted many long after release. In some cases, captivity lasted years. Life continued elsewhere while the knight remained frozen in place. Relationships weakened. Influence faded. Relevance declined. This reality shaped medieval warfare. Battles were not just about survival, but about avoiding outcomes worse than death. Every decision carried this weight. Capture was not a rare exception, it was an expected risk. Knights prepared for it mentally, but preparation did not soften its impact. In the end, captivity revealed how fragile the knightly identity truly was. Remove armor, weapons, and freedom, and what remained was a person struggling to endure time itself. This was the quiet fear beneath every charge and every stand. Not just falling in battle, but living afterward in chains, waiting for a future that might never arrive. A knight's image was built on steel, banners, and battlefield presence, but the reality behind that image was almost always financial strain. Wealth was never guaranteed by the title alone. In fact, Carrying the status of knighthood often meant living under constant economic pressure. Equipment came first, and it never stopped demanding money. Armor was not a one-time purchase. Plates cracked, mail stretched, straps tore, padding wore out. Every campaign damaged something. Repairs were expensive, and replacements even more so. A knight who failed to maintain his gear risked injury or death, so cutting costs was rarely an option. Weapons followed the same pattern. Swords dulled or chipped. Lances shattered after single charges. Shields split under repeated blows. None of these were decorative items. They were tools, and tools wore down fast in war. Keeping them functional required steady spending. Then there was the horse, not just any horse, but a war horse trained for combat. These animals were rare, fragile, and costly. Feeding them alone strained finances. Add injuries, illness, or loss in battle, and the expense multiplied. Replacing a fallen horse could wipe out months or years of income. Knights were also expected to look the part. Clothing, heraldry, and presentation mattered socially and politically. Appearances reinforced status. Poor presentation damaged reputation, which in turn reduced opportunities for patronage or advancement. Income sources were unreliable. Some knights held land, but many did not. Others depended on stipends from lords or spoils from war, both inconsistent. Campaigns could last months with no payment at all. Loot was never guaranteed and often disappointing. Even successful campaigns carried costs. Travel consumed money. Supplies had to be purchased. Servants or squires needed food and equipment. A knight rarely traveled alone, and every additional person increased expenses. Debt became common. Loans were taken to fund equipment or campaigns, often at harsh terms. Interest accumulated quickly. Failure to repay damaged standing and independence. A knight in debt became vulnerable to pressure and obligation. Ransoms offered occasional relief, but were unpredictable. Capturing an enemy knight did not guarantee payment. Negotiations took time, and many ransoms were never fully paid. Even when successful, the money often went straight to creditors. Peacetime did not bring financial relief. Without active campaigns, income shrank while costs continued. Equipment still required maintenance. Horses still needed care. Social expectations remained. Some knights turned to tournaments hoping for prize money, but tournaments carried their own risks and expenses. Entry fees, travel, and damaged equipment often outweighed winnings. Injury could end participation entirely. Others sought service under wealthier lords, trading independence for stability. This reduced autonomy and tied the knight's fortunes to another's ambitions. The pressure affected daily life. Knights postponed repairs, reused damaged gear, and accepted inferior equipment when funds ran low. These compromises increased danger in combat. Family obligations added further strain. Supporting households, relatives, or heirs stretched limited resources thinner. Marriage alliances sometimes eased finances, but just as often introduced new responsibilities. Reputation masked reality. Outsiders saw armor and assumed wealth. Inside, accounts rarely balanced. The knightly lifestyle consumed money faster than it generated it. This constant scarcity shaped behavior. Knights chased opportunities aggressively, sometimes recklessly. Risk-taking was not always about glory, but about survival. Loss hit harder when money was scarce. A broken sword or wounded horse could not simply be replaced. Each setback carried long-term consequences. Even older knights rarely reached financial comfort. Years of service left bodies worn and savings thin. Retirement was uncertain, often dependent on charity or continued minor service. The myth of the wealthy knight persisted because it was useful. Lords, poets, and chroniclers preferred the image. Reality was quieter and far more strained. In truth, knighthood was less a path to wealth and more a commitment to constant financial juggling. Prestige came at a price that never stopped increasing. Behind the armor stood men calculating costs, negotiating debts, and hoping the next campaign would finally bring relief that almost never lasted. Loyalty in the medieval knightly world was never a single clear line. It was layered, shifting, and often contradictory. A knight's sworn word mattered, but the reality around that oath constantly tested it. Allegiance was shaped not only by honor, but by survival, pressure, obligation, and fear. At the center stood the Lord. Swearing fealty bound a knight to serve, protect, and fight when called. This bond was supposed to be absolute, yet it rarely existed in isolation. Lords themselves answered to higher powers, held overlapping claims, or clashed with neighboring nobles. When those conflicts erupted, knights were pulled into struggles that had little to do with personal belief. Land complicated everything. Many knights held fiefs granted by one lord while serving another militarily. If those lords fell into conflict, neutrality became impossible. Choosing one side meant betraying the other. Refusing to choose risked losing both protection and land. Family ties pulled in different directions. A knight might be sworn to one lord, born into another's domain, and married into a third family's influence. Blood loyalty did not vanish upon knighthood. When wars broke out, relatives could easily find themselves on opposite sides. Loyalty to kin clashed with sworn duty, and neither choice came without cost. Church authority added another layer. Religious oaths, moral obligations, and pressure from clerics could override secular loyalty. A knight ordered to fight against a cause declared unjust by the church faced spiritual consequences alongside worldly punishment. Obedience to faith and obedience to Lord were not always aligned. Political shifts turned loyalty into a gamble. Lords rose and fell quickly. Supporting the wrong side could strip a knight of land, title, and future. Switching allegiance was dangerous, but sometimes necessary. Remaining loyal to a losing lord often meant ruin. This instability encouraged pragmatism. Knights learned to read situations carefully, weighing honor against outcome. Absolute loyalty existed more in stories than in lived experience. Decisions were made quietly, sometimes delayed until a victor became clear. Battlefields did not simplify matters. Combat often brought knights face to face with former allies serving different banners. Orders conflicted, confusion reigned. Striking an old companion was not heroic, but hesitation could mean death. Oaths themselves could conflict. A knight might swear to protect a territory while also pledging to follow a lord into battle elsewhere. When threats emerged in both places, one promise had to break. There was no clean resolution. Mercenary service blurred loyalty further. Some knights served for pay, temporarily attaching themselves to causes without deep allegiance. This was frowned upon publicly but common in practice, especially during periods of prolonged conflict. Punishment for perceived disloyalty was severe. Confiscation of land, imprisonment, or execution awaited those judged traitors. Fear shaped decisions as much as honor did. Loyalty enforced by threat carried less moral weight but stronger immediate consequences. Public loyalty differed from private intent. Knights learned to perform allegiance outwardly while quietly protecting their own interests. Survival depended on adaptability. Rigid devotion often ended careers early. Reputation mattered. Being seen as unreliable closed doors. Being seen as blindly loyal could be exploited. Balancing these perceptions required careful behavior and calculated restraint. Even victories strained loyalty. Successful campaigns led to disputes over rewards, land, and recognition. Knights who felt overlooked grew resentful. Loyalty weakened not through betrayal, but through neglect. Time changed everything. Long service created fatigue. Years of fighting for causes that brought little personal gain eroded dedication. Knights aged, priorities shifted, and loyalties followed. Captivity tested allegiance harshly. Prisoners were pressured to swear new oaths in exchange for freedom. Refusal meant prolonged suffering. Acceptance meant living with the consequences of broken loyalty. Written contracts rarely captured reality. Feudal agreements assumed clear hierarchies that seldom existed. Borderlands, contested titles, and overlapping claims produced constant ambiguity. In the end, loyalty functioned less as a moral absolute and more as a negotiated condition. It bent under stress, adapted to circumstance, and survived through compromise. The romantic image of unwavering devotion ignores the fragile balance knights maintained daily. They navigated a world where every choice carried risk, and standing still was rarely an option. Loyalty was not abandoned lightly, but neither was it simple. It lived in the space between duty and necessity, shaped by forces far larger than individual will. When banners were lowered and armies dispersed, the tension did not disappear. The absence of open war created a different kind of strain, quieter but constant. For knights, peace rarely meant rest. It meant vigilance without spectacle, danger without clarity, and responsibility without glory. Castles did not sleep during peacetime. Gates still closed at dusk. Towers remained manned. Watches rotated through long nights where nothing happened, until suddenly it did. The threat was never gone. It simply changed shape. Instead of enemy armies, there were whispers, movements in the dark, and signs that something was wrong just beyond the walls. Nobles feared betrayal most when swords were sheathed. Rival lords watched one another closely, probing borders, testing resolve. Knights were sent on patrols not to fight, but to be seen. Presence itself became a weapon. Riding the same roads again and again was meant to remind villages who held power, and to warn rivals that strength was still close at hand. Patrol duty was exhausting in a way battle was not. Long hours in the saddle, repetitive routes, little recognition. There were no songs written about uneventful rides through misty forests or empty crossroads. Yet mistakes made during these routines could cost lives. A missed sign, a careless guard, a delayed response. Small failures had consequences. Banditry flourished when wars paused. Displaced soldiers, unpaid mercenaries, deserters, and the desperate gathered in forests and hills. They knew the land. They struck quickly and vanished just as fast. Knights tasked with hunting them found themselves chasing shadows, never certain whether they were facing criminals or the early signs of organized rebellion. Internal unrest was more dangerous than foreign threats. Peasants pushed too hard, taxes collected too aggressively, old grievances left to rot. Any of these could ignite violence. Knights were often the first line of response, sent not to conquer, but to suppress. This work demanded restraint as much as force, and failure in either direction invited disaster. Suppress too harshly, and resentment deepened. Act too gently, and authority weakened. Knights walked this line constantly, acting as enforcers for decisions they did not make, absorbing the hatred that followed. In peacetime, their armor inspired fear rather than protection. Castles became political pressure cookers. With no campaigns to distract them, lords turned inward. Court intrigue intensified. Accusations spread. Alliances shifted quietly. Knights were pulled into these games whether they wanted to be or not, assigned as guards, escorts, witnesses, or threats. Guard duty inside a castle was not passive. A knight stood between ambition and opportunity. Poisonings, secret meetings, and sudden arrests were not rare. Violence did not vanish. It simply moved indoors and became more controlled. Training never stopped. Weapons dulled with use and had to be maintained. Horses required constant care. Drills continued, often harsher than wartime training, because there was time to focus on discipline. Injuries during practice were common, and just as dangerous as those suffered in battle. Peacetime also meant preparation for the next conflict, because everyone knew it would come. Supplies were gathered, defenses reinforced. Scouts sent quietly into neighboring territories. Knights acted as the nervous system of this preparation, carrying messages, inspecting fortifications, and reporting on anything unusual. Knights were the worst. During war, danger was expected. During peace, it crept. A single alarm bell could shatter months of calm. Knights learned to sleep lightly, always half ready. The body never truly recovered. Borders were especially tense. Disputed lands did not become safer just because armies withdrew. Instead, small-scale violence replaced open war. Raids, livestock theft, ambushes, conflicts that could not officially be acknowledged but demanded response. Knights fought these skirmishes, knowing that escalation could restart full war at any moment. Justice fell heavily on knights in peacetime. They enforced laws that were uneven and often unjust. Executions, punishments, property seizures. These tasks stained reputations. A knight remembered for hanging villagers would not be celebrated later, no matter how necessary the act was considered. The absence of external enemies turned attention inward. Loyalty, already strained, faced new tests. Knights questioned why they served, what they protected, and whether peace benefited them at all. Pay was often delayed. Rewards promised during war evaporated once the threat passed. Idle time bred doubt. Without battle to define purpose, knights confronted exhaustion and disillusionment. Some drank, some gambled. Others sought conflict where none officially existed, escalating minor disputes into violence simply to feel useful. Religion offered structure but also pressure. Clergy reminded knights of moral duty during peace, condemning excess and brutality. This restraint clashed with habits formed during war. Adjusting was difficult, and failures were judged harshly. Communication during peacetime was relentless. Messengers arrived constantly with orders, rumors, or demands. Knights rode more during peace than war, covering distances without rest, carrying information that could shift power balances. Even festivals carried risk. Large gatherings invited unrest, assassination attempts, or rebellion disguised as celebration. Knights stood armored among crowds, watching faces rather than enjoying the moment. Relaxation was never complete. The idea that peace was a reward misunderstood its nature. For knights, it was a different battlefield, one without clear enemies or victories. The tension lingered, stretched thin, but unbroken. Every quiet year sharpened the next war. Grudges hardened, preparations matured, knights aged under the weight of constant readiness. By the time banners rose again, they were already tired. Peace did not heal wounds, it exposed them. Physical injuries worsened without the distraction of battle. Old scars ached, unhealed trauma surfaced in stillness. Through all of this, knights endured. Not because peace was kind, but because it demanded endurance of a different sort. They remained alert in silence, disciplined without applause, and burdened by a calm that never truly felt safe. When war returned, it felt almost familiar. By the time peace settled into its uneasy routine, knights were expected to become something else entirely. Not just guards, not just soldiers, but symbols. The code of chivalry demanded more than strength. It asked for honor, restraint, mercy, loyalty, faith, and discipline, all at once, all the time. On parchment, the code was clear. In life, it was not. A knight was told to be brave, but not reckless, firm, but not cruel, loyal, but not blind, merciful, but never weak. Each rule made sense on its own. Together, they often clashed. Living by the code meant choosing which rule to break when they could not all be kept. In battle, chivalry was easier to define. Protect the weak, fight fairly, face your enemy openly. But most of a knight's life was not spent in open combat. It was lived in halls, on roads, in villages, and in moments where the right choice was never obvious. Take mercy, for example. The code praised mercy as a virtue. Spare the defeated. Show compassion. But mercy could create future enemies. A spared bandit might return with friends. A forgiven rebel might start another uprising. Knights learned quickly that mercy carried risk, and sometimes blame. Honor was another heavy burden. A knight's word was meant to be unbreakable. Promises mattered. Oaths defined identity. But lords made conflicting demands. Orders changed. Political needs overruled old vows. A knight could keep one promise only by breaking another. Loyalty sat at the center of everything. loyalty to one's lord, loyalty to the crown, loyalty to fellow knights, loyalty to faith, loyalty to conscience. The code never explained what to do when these loyalties pointed in different directions. Many knights discovered that loyalty was praised most when it benefited those in power. The code demanded respect for all, especially women and the defenseless. Yet knights were also agents of authority. They collected taxes, enforced laws, and carried out punishments. Being polite while taking a family's last grain did not feel noble, no matter how gently it was done. Courtesy became a performance. Knights learned the right words, gestures, and rituals. Bowing, kneeling, formal speech. These were shields of a different kind. They softened actions that could not truly be softened. Inside, many felt the gap between what they were taught and what they were asked to do. Chivalry also required restraint. A knight was not supposed to give in to anger, greed, or desire, yet knights were human. Long years of stress, fear, and boredom wore down discipline. Tempers flared. Mistakes happened. And when they did, the fall was harder, because the expectations were higher. A farmer who lost control was forgiven. A knight who did the same was judged. The code spoke of fairness in combat. But real fights were messy. Ambushes saved lives. Dirty tricks ended conflicts faster. Refusing an advantage in the name of honor could get comrades killed. Many knights quietly ignored parts of the code when survival demanded it, then lived with the guilt afterward. Faith was woven tightly into chivalry. Knights were meant to defend the church, obey its teachings, and live moral lives. But faith did not answer every question. Priests did not ride patrols. They did not face knives in the dark or mobs at the gate. Knights had to make choices first and confess later. Some found comfort in belief. Others felt crushed by it. Brotherhood among knights was praised as sacred. Trust your brothers. Stand together, never abandon one another. In practice, rivalry was common. Advancement was limited. Favor was uneven. Knights competed for recognition, land, and survival. When resources were scarce, ideals weakened. Training emphasized discipline and unity, but real bonds formed through shared hardship, not oaths. A knight trusted those who bled beside him, not those who spoke prettily of honor. The code also expected knights to be examples for the people. Their behavior was watched, judged, copied, or feared. One public mistake could erase years of service. Rumors spread fast, especially during peacetime, when people looked for stories. A knight could win 10 fights and still be remembered for one failure. Love and relationships were another quiet conflict. Chivalry romanticized devotion and courtly love, but real attachments complicated duty. Loving someone made choices harder. Leaving became painful. Staying became dangerous. Many knights chose distance over connection, not out of coldness, but necessity. As years passed, the code felt less like guidance and more like weight. Not because it was wrong, but because it asked for perfection in an imperfect world. Knights learned to live in the space between ideal and reality. Some adapted. They followed the spirit of the code rather than its letter. They chose kindness when possible, firmness when needed, and accepted that judgment would come no matter what. Others hardened. They treated the code as a story for children and nobles, something to be recited, not lived. They did what was required and ignored the rest. A few broke entirely. The pressure cracked them. They became cruel, cynical, or reckless, hiding behind armor and reputation. Yet even then, the code never truly left. It lingered in moments of doubt, in hesitation before a killing blow, in the urge to help when turning away would be easier. Chivalry was not a rule book. It was a constant argument inside the mind. The hardest part was that failure was unavoidable. No knight lived the code perfectly. Those who claimed they did were lying, to others or themselves. And still, knights tried. Not because the world rewarded them, but because without the code, there was nothing to hold on to. War taught them how to fight. Peace taught them how to endure. Chivalry reminded them why they were more than hired blades. Even when they fell short, the effort mattered. Because in a world where peace was uneasy, loyalty was tangled, and violence was always close, trying to live by something better, even imperfectly, was its own kind of courage. Living by the code was already hard. Keeping a good name while doing it was even harder. A knight could survive wounds, hunger, and long years of service. But reputation was fragile. It did not bleed slowly. It shattered fast, sometimes in a single night. Honor was not something a knight owned alone. It lived in the eyes of others. What people believed often mattered more than what truly happened. And once doubt appeared, it spread quietly, like a crack in ice. In villages, stories traveled faster than truth. A raised voice, a harsh order, a moment of anger, any of these could grow into something darker by the time it reached the next town. By the time it reached a lord's hall, it was no longer a moment, it was a reputation. Knights learned that silence did not protect them. Doing the right thing did not always protect them either. Being seen mattered as much as being just. A single accusation could undo years of service. Sometimes it was fair, sometimes it was not. It rarely mattered which. Honor and rumor walked side by side. When they moved together, a knight rose quickly. When they split, the fall was sudden. Peacetime made this worse. In war, actions spoke clearly. In peace, people watched behavior. Small choices became big signals. Who a knight spoke to, who they ignored, where they stood in a hall, who greeted them, and who did not. Reputation became a second armor, invisible but heavy. Knights who were once praised could become whispers. He used to be honorable. She was different before. Words like these ended careers without drawing a blade. And once doubt took hold, everything was reread. Past actions were questioned. Old victories felt smaller. Good deeds were seen as accidents or tricks. Trying to defend oneself often made things worse. Explaining sounded like excuses. Anger sounded like guilt. Silence sounded like acceptance. There was no clean way to fight a rumor. Some knights learned to live carefully, too carefully. They avoided risk, avoided strong choices, avoided standing out. Safety became more important than justice. It kept their names clean but hollow. Others refused to bend. They acted as they always had, trusting truth to survive on its own. Sometimes it did. Often it did not. Reputation did not care about intentions. The code of chivalry spoke of honor as something inside the soul. The world treated honor as something public, a shared story, a fragile agreement. Lose it, and doors closed, invitations stopped, orders changed, trust faded. A knight with a damaged name was still dangerous, still skilled, but no longer welcome, and being unwanted was its own kind of exile. Rumors did not need proof. They needed repetition. Each retelling made them feel more real. Each nod added weight. Even friends grew distant, not out of cruelty but caution. Standing too close to a fallen name could stain their own. Loneliness followed loss of honor more closely than punishment ever did. Some knights tried to rebuild. It took years, quiet service, patience, small acts done without praise. Even then, recovery was never complete. A shadow always remained. Others left. They rode away from courts and banners, choosing borders, roads, or obscurity. Better to live without a name than with a broken one. And some broke entirely. When reputation was all that separated knight from mercenary, losing it erased the reason to keep trying. Yet fear of loss also shaped behavior. Knights measured words, controlled expressions, smiled when tired, stayed calm when insulted. Not because they were weak, but because one moment of honesty could cost everything. The hardest truth was this: a knight could do everything right and still fall. Wrong place, wrong witness, wrong story told at the wrong time. Reputation did not reward effort, it rewarded appearance. And still, knights cared, deeply, because without honor, the code lost meaning. Without trust, strength meant nothing. So they walked carefully, carrying both steel and self-control, knowing that every day, Every choice, every glance, could be the one people remembered. Not the battles won, not the lives saved, but the mistake. Reputation could fade in a night. Age worked slower, but it was just as cruel. No announcement marked its arrival. No trumpet warned a knight that time had turned against him. Aging came quietly, hiding in small moments that were easy to ignore at first. A sword felt heavier than it used to. Armor took longer to fasten. Wounds that once closed in days now stayed for weeks. None of these things felt dangerous alone. Together, they changed everything. Knighthood was built on strength, speed, and endurance. Youth was never written into the code, but it was always assumed. The world expected knights to be ready, always mounted, always steady, always capable. Age made readiness uncertain. Older knights still remembered how it felt to be fast. That memory was the hardest part. They knew what their bodies used to do. They felt the delay before a strike, the hesitation before a charge, the stiffness when rising after a fall. No one spoke openly about it. A knight admitting weakness risked more than pride. He risked his place. There were no gentle retirements, no honored farewell for growing old. Knighthood did not plan for decline. It only planned for glory or death. As younger knights arrived, sharper and stronger, the change became visible. They rode faster, fought harder, recovered quicker. Lords noticed, commanders adjusted. The older knight was still skilled, but skill mattered less when strength decided the moment. Slowly, duties changed. Front lines became back lines. Duels became guards. Leading charges turned into holding positions. At first, this felt like trust, experience being valued, wisdom respected. Later, it felt like distance. The songs no longer mentioned the old names. The cheers followed new banners. Stories shifted forward, never back. Aging knights stood in halls where they once stood at the center. Now, they were edges, corners, observers. Being forgotten hurt more than being wounded. Younger knights asked fewer questions. They listened politely, then did as they wished. Experience became advice instead of authority. The world moved on without asking permission. Some knights tried to fight age itself. They trained harder, pushed longer, refused rest. They ignored pain and weakness, hoping discipline could defeat time. Sometimes it worked, briefly. More often, it ended badly. A fall that would have been harmless years ago now shattered bones. A wound reopened. A mistake became fatal. Age punished denial. Others accepted their limits, but found no place to put them. There were few roles for knights who could not fight at full strength. Teaching was rare. Command required political favor. Most paths were already claimed. So they waited. Waiting was the cruelest duty of all. They waited for assignments that never came, for battles they would not ride into, for recognition that would not return. Some were still called knights. Few were treated like one. Even loyalty changed shape. Lords preferred young strength over old service. Promises faded as priorities shifted. A knight who had served faithfully for decades could be set aside with quiet efficiency. No anger, no ceremony, just absence. The body weakened, but the mind stayed sharp. That made it worse. An aging knight saw every mistake, every poor choice, every reckless act, yet lacked the power to stop them. Watching others fail where you once succeeded is a slow kind of torture. Pride became complicated. There was pride in survival, but shame in limitation. Pride in memory, but pain in comparison. Some knights clung to their past, repeating old stories to anyone who would listen. Others fell silent, afraid their memories sounded like boasting. Both paths led to loneliness. Armor became a reminder. Each piece once felt like purpose. Now it felt like weight, something carried for identity more than need. Still, many wore it, not for battle, but to remember who they were. Age did not only take strength, it took relevance. Knights lived in a world that valued action. Stillness had no reward. Reflection earned no applause. And yet, aging knights carried something rare: restraint, patience, the knowledge of cost. But these were quiet virtues, easy to overlook. Some tried to leave before being pushed out. They sought land, families, or quiet service far from courts. It was a softer ending, but still an ending. Others stayed too long, hoping for one last moment, one last chance to matter. Sometimes they got it. Often, they did not. Death was not the fear. Being useless was. To fight and fail was honorable. To stand aside and fade felt like betrayal of everything knighthood promised. The code spoke of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. It did not speak of what happened after the body stopped obeying. Age revealed the truth beneath the ideal. Knighthood was never meant to last. And yet, knights endured, even when unseen, even when ignored. They carried memory when others carried steel. They held the line in quieter ways, keeping order, preventing mistakes, slowing chaos. No songs praised this, no banners marked it. But without them, the world would have been poorer, faster, more reckless. Aging was not dramatic. It did not strike suddenly like a blade. It pressed slowly, day by day, until resistance felt pointless. And still, knights rose each morning, fastened armor, took positions, spoke when needed, stayed silent when not, because even when strength faded, duty remained. And for many knights, that was enough to keep going, even as the world forgot their names. Age weakened the body. Reputation could fade. But what came after was even more unclear. There was no clean ending to a knight's life of service. No clear moment where duty stopped and safety began. Retirement, as we understand it today, did not really exist. A knight did not simply decide to step away. There was no fixed age, no promise of rest, no system waiting to support him once he could no longer fight. When strength faded and usefulness was questioned, the future became uncertain very quickly. Everything depended on land. If a knight owned land, life after service could be stable. Land meant food, shelter, and a place in society. It meant tenants who worked the fields and paid rent. It meant a reason to be respected even without armor. But most knights did not own land. Many served in hopes of earning it one day. Others inherited nothing and never received enough reward to change that. Years of loyalty did not guarantee property. Service alone was rarely enough. Without land, there was no real retirement, only continuation in a weaker form. Some aging knights remained attached to their lord's household. They stayed on as guards, messengers, or quiet enforcers. The work was lighter, but still demanding. Pay was smaller. Respect was thinner. They were useful, but replaceable. Others became instructors, teaching young knights basic skills and discipline. This depended entirely on trust and favor. One disagreement, one change in leadership, and the position disappeared. Teaching was never secure. Many knights ended up drifting, from castle to castle, from border to border, offering service where it was needed, even if their bodies protested. They lowered expectations and accepted lesser roles. This was not freedom. It was survival. A knight without land had few options outside knighthood. Farming required tools, animals, and space. Trade required training they never received. Begging destroyed the honor they had spent a lifetime building. So they stayed close to the only world they knew. Some married late, hoping family ties might create stability. Marriage could offer shelter, but it also added responsibility. Another mouth to feed. Another future to worry about. Without land, even marriage was fragile. Aging knights often depended on goodwill from former comrades, from lords who remembered old service, from institutions tied to the church. Goodwill was not reliable. If a lord died, promises often died with him. A new lord might see an old knight as a burden rather than an asset. Loyalty did not always transfer. This uncertainty followed knights everywhere. They planned nothing because nothing could be planned. There was also pride. Asking for help felt like failure. Accepting charity felt like defeat. Knights were trained to give protection, not receive it. So many endured quietly. They ate less, slept in worse places, accepted discomfort without complaint. Better to suffer privately than admit need. Some found places in monasteries or religious houses. This was not retirement and comfort, but it offered shelter and food. For knights who still believed deeply, it also offered peace. Others took vows not out of calling, but necessity. Yet even there, not everyone was welcome. Space was limited, resources were thin, age did not guarantee acceptance. The idea of rest was almost foreign. Knights did not imagine a future of leisure, they imagined usefulness. Even when tired, even when weak. To stop entirely felt unnatural. Those who were lucky enough to hold land still worked it. They managed disputes, collected rent, defended borders when needed. Retirement did not mean stillness, it meant a different kind of labor. For those without land, the end was often slow and unclear. No final moment, no recognition, just a gradual stepping back until no one asked them forward again. Knighthood did not end cleanly, it dissolved. This created fear long before age arrived. Younger knights watched older ones carefully. They saw what waited. They learned early that service did not guarantee security. This knowledge shaped behavior. It made knights cautious, protective of reputation, desperate for favor. A single gift of land could change everything. Without it, the future remained thin and unstable. Some knights gambled everything for that chance, took dangerous missions, accepted impossible tasks, risked injury and disgrace, hoping for reward. Others avoided risk, hoping longevity might earn favor over time. Neither path was safe. The silence around retirement was heavy. No one liked to speak about it. It reminded everyone that knighthood was not a lifelong shield. Steel protected the body. Titles protected status. Neither protected the future. In the end, retirement was not a stage of life. It was a condition, temporary, uncertain, and dependent on others. A knight could serve faithfully for decades and still face old age with empty hands. And yet, they continued. They rode, they guarded, they obeyed. Because even without a promise of rest, duty remained familiar. It gave shape to days that might otherwise collapse into waiting. For many knights, it was better to remain useful than to sit idle and forgotten. So they stayed close to the road, close to the hall, close to the sound of armor. Not because it was safe, but because it was all they had left. When the future offered no clear rest, many knights turned inward. Not because faith was easy, but because it was always there. Churches stood where promises failed. Prayers existed when plans did not. Faith was part of a knight's life from the beginning. It shaped vows, justified wars, and framed ideas of honor. But it did not erase fear. It lived beside it. Knights believed deeply. Many truly did. They prayed before battles. They crossed themselves before sleep. They carried symbols of faith into combat, not as decoration, but as protection. Still, belief did not calm the body when death felt close. The idea of dying was never abstract. Knights saw it often. They watched friends fall. They heard final breaths. They buried bodies quickly, sometimes without names. Death was not distant. It was familiar. Faith promised meaning, but it did not soften the moment itself. Before battle, fear crept in quietly. Not panic, but awareness. The knowledge that this time could be the last. That armor might fail. That skill might not matter. Prayers did not stop hands from shaking. They gave direction to the fear, not an escape from it. Knights feared not only death but judgment. Faith taught that dying well mattered. A good death could lead to peace. A bad one could follow the soul forever. This created a second weight. Not just fear of dying, but fear of dying wrong. Was the last thought pure enough? Was the final act honorable enough? Was the soul clean? Confession became important, but it was not always available. Battles did not wait for priests. Death did not schedule itself. Many knights worried about sins carried into combat. Violence was justified, but not clean. Killing left marks, even when ordered, even when praised. Faith did not deny this. It reminded knights that every act mattered. This made nights long. Sleep came unevenly. Thoughts circled. Memories returned. Faces of enemies mixed with faces of friends. The line between duty and guilt was not always clear. Prayer offered structure. Words learned early, repeated often. They gave shape to the darkness, but they did not erase doubt. Some knights feared hell more than death. Others feared dying forgotten. Faith spoke of salvation, but the world still judged reputation and memory. A knight could be saved in the next life, and still erased in this one. This tension followed them everywhere. Churches offered comfort, but also reminders. Paintings showed judgment. Sermons spoke of sin. Even forgiveness came with reflection on failure. Faith did not say, "Do not be afraid." It said, "Fear wisely." Knights were taught that fear was not weakness. Losing control was. Courage did not mean absence of fear. It meant moving forward with it present. This idea helped, but it did not remove the weight. As knights aged, fear changed shape. It was no longer about dying young. It was about dying slowly, alone, without purpose. Faith promised that all lives mattered, but knights lived in a world that valued action. Waiting felt like failure. Silence felt like punishment. Prayer filled time, but not identity. Some knights became deeply religious late in life, not out of sudden belief, but out of need. Faith offered a place to put regret, a way to frame past actions. Others resisted it, afraid of what reflection might reveal. Both paths carried fear. There was also fear of hypocrisy. Knights were told to be just, merciful, and restrained. Reality demanded violence, pressure, and obedience. Reconciling these things was not simple. Faith gave language to the conflict, but not easy answers. On the battlefield, faith was practical. It helped focus, it narrowed the mind, it turned chaos into purpose. Afterward, it asked questions. Did intention matter more than result? Did obedience excuse harm? Could repeated violence still lead to peace of soul? Knights carried these questions quietly. They were not debated openly. Doubt was private. Faith communities offered guidance but not certainty. Even priests disagreed. Even holy texts required interpretation. So knights lived with tension, believing, fearing, acting. They did not expect faith to remove fear. They expected it to help them endure it. In this way, belief was not comfort. It was responsibility. Every choice mattered beyond the moment. Every act echoed beyond life. This made fear sharper, not softer. Yet without faith, fear might have been unbearable. Faith gave fear a boundary, a beginning and an end, a reason to keep going when answers were unclear. It reminded knights that their lives were part of something larger, even when that something felt distant. And so they prayed, not for safety always, often for strength, for steadiness, for forgiveness. Fear remained, but it was faced. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, night after night. In the end, faith did not promise peace in life. It promised meaning beyond it. For knights who lived with constant uncertainty, that promise mattered, even when fear never fully left. As faith helped knights carry fear, another truth slowly became harder to ignore. No matter how personal their struggles felt, most of their lives were shaped by forces far bigger than themselves. Knights liked to believe they were acting by choice, that their courage, skill, and loyalty placed them at the center of events. But over time, many realized they were not the center at all. They were part of a system that moved, whether they agreed with it or not. Kings, lords, and rulers made decisions far from the battlefield. These decisions shaped wars, borders, and alliances. Knights were expected to follow, not question. Orders traveled downward. Consequences traveled upward. A knight rarely knew the full reason behind a conflict. He knew who to fight, where to ride, and when to stand ready. The why was often unclear. or explained in simple terms that hid deeper interests. Politics was quiet, slow, and distant. War was loud, fast, and close. Knights lived in the second world, but served the first. Land disputes, marriages between noble families, broken agreements, and rival claims could all lead to bloodshed. Knights were told these causes were just. Sometimes they were, sometimes they were only convenient. Either way, knights did not choose which wars mattered. When rulers argued, knights marched. When treaties failed, knights fought. When ambitions grew, knights paid the price. The system depended on this obedience. Knights were trained to respect authority. Loyalty was praised above doubt. Questioning orders could be seen as weakness or betrayal. Even hesitation carried risk. So most knights did what was expected. They followed banners. They defended borders they did not draw. They attacked towns they had never seen before. They were not villains. They were not heroes. They were instruments. This did not mean knights were mindless. Many understood what was happening. They saw patterns repeat. A war ended, another began. A king died, a son continued the same struggle. The reasons changed. The outcomes stayed familiar. For some knights, this created distance from the idea of glory. They stopped expecting meaning from each battle. Duty became mechanical. Survive, obey, move on. Others clung to personal honor as a way to feel human within the system. If the cause was unclear, at least behavior could be controlled. Fight fairly, protect allies. Avoid cruelty when possible. This was a small rebellion, quiet, internal, and limited. The system did not reward kindness, it rewarded results. Knights who succeeded were promoted, remembered, and trusted again. Those who failed were replaced. The system did not mourn individuals, it adjusted. Even loyalty had limits. A knight loyal to one lord could be ordered to fight another he once served. Alliances shifted. Enemies became allies. Memory was inconvenient. Knights adapted because they had to. The system also needed fear. Fear kept knights obedient. Fear of punishment. Fear of disgrace. Fear of losing what little security they had. Land, protection, and status were controlled from above. Step out of line and these could vanish quickly. Knights learned to balance pride with caution. Kings spoke of unity and duty. Lords spoke of protection and reward. But at the core, the system was about control. Who commanded force? Who benefited from it? Knights provided that force. They did not own it, they carried it. This became clearer with time, especially for older knights who had served many rulers. They saw promises made and broken. They saw loyalty praised, then forgotten. They understood that the system would survive them. This realization could be heavy. It made sacrifice feel smaller. It made suffering feel less personal. But it also brought clarity. Knights stopped expecting fairness. They stopped waiting for gratitude. They focused on endurance. If meaning would not come from the system, it had to come from within. Some knights found peace in this acceptance. They stopped fighting the truth. They did their role, knowing it was temporary and limited. Others struggled. They felt used, discarded, replaceable. Both reactions were natural. The system did not care which one they chose. Knights were not asked to understand politics. They were asked to enforce outcomes. Their armor, horses, and weapons were tools just as much as they were symbols. This does not make their lives meaningless. It makes them human. They lived inside a structure they did not build. They carried weight they did not choose. They acted under pressure they could not escape. In stories, knights stand alone. In reality, they stood in long lines, part of something larger, often unseen. Understanding this does not remove their bravery, it explains its cost. They were not shining heroes moving freely across history. They were working parts in a system that valued results over lives. And still, they endured. They showed discipline. They carried responsibility. They faced fear, age, uncertainty, and loss without stepping away. Not because the system was kind, but because duty gave shape to their existence. In the end, knights were not legends walking the world by choice. They were people shaped by power, expectation, and necessity. They were not the story being told. They were how the story moved forward. After years of service, fear, duty, and obedience to a system larger than themselves, most knights did not reach a dramatic ending. There was no final battle that closed their story, no crowd watching, no songs written in their honor. For many, life simply slowed down. The armor that once felt like a second skin became heavy. The sword that once moved easily began to strain tired arms. Horses sensed the change before anyone else. Knees ached. Old wounds woke up in cold weather. Vision faded. Balance weakened. There was no clear moment when a knight stopped being a knight. He just rode less, trained less, spoke less. The world moved on quietly. Some knights were lucky enough to return to land they could call home. A small estate, a modest house, a few fields. Not enough to feel rich, but enough to feel stable. They watched seasons change instead of battle lines. Others were not so lucky. Many knights had no land waiting for them, no savings, no safety. When strength faded, so did their value. The system that once needed them no longer did. These knights faded into towns, villages, or monasteries. Some became guards. Some trained younger men. Some worked land they once rode past without noticing. Their hands still carried scars. Their posture still showed discipline, but their names were rarely remembered. Stories prefer endings with meaning. Real life often ends with routine. A knight might die in bed, surrounded not by comrades but by silence. No armor, no banner, just a body that had carried too much for too long. Death itself was rarely dramatic. Illness was common. Infections, fever, and weakness claimed many more lives than swords ever did. The same body that survived battle could fail quietly at home. Faith was still present. Prayers were whispered. Forgiveness was hoped for. Fear remained, even at the end. Not fear of pain, but fear of being forgotten. Knights spent their lives being seen, watched, judged, measured by strength and action. In the end, invisibility was harder than death. Some were buried with symbols of their past, a sword, a small cross, a worn piece of armor. But most graves were simple, wooden markers, if any at all. No crowds gathered. Time erased names quickly. This does not mean their lives lacked value. It means history chooses what to remember. Knights lived inside long chains of cause and effect. Their actions shaped borders, protected families, destroyed towns, and upheld power. But once the moment passed, the system moved forward without looking back. Younger knights took their place. New wars replaced old ones. The world stayed busy. For those who lived long enough to reflect, this realization brought mixed feelings. Pride and regret sat side by side. Honor and doubt shared space. Some wondered if it had been worth it. Others did not question at all. Life had been duty. Duty had been life. There was no separation. Old knights often spoke less of glory and more of small things. A good meal, a quiet morning, a peaceful night without alarms. These were victories too, just never celebrated. The quiet end of a knight's life shows the truth behind the legend. Not every life needs a climax. Most lives simply conclude. What makes this ending powerful is not drama, but honesty. Knights were not born for endings. They were trained for service. When service ended, there was no script to follow. They became ordinary again. And perhaps that is the most human part of their story. After carrying fear, faith, loyalty, and control for so long, they returned to silence, to dust, to memory held by a few, then fewer. The legend fades. The person remains, briefly. Then even that disappears. Not with noise, but quietly. If you've made it this far and this video helped you in any way, Sharing it with someone you care about really means a lot. A like, a comment, or a subscription helps the channel grow and gives me the motivation to keep making videos like this. Until the next evening, take good care of yourself.